Nintendo has now announced backwards compatibility for the Switch successor. And look, this is a huge deal, and I think it's very positive. I know YouTuber and game developer Modern Vintage Gamer has explained in detail in the past why backwards compatibility is not as easy as might be assumed to put onto the console, and it does come with costs for Nintendo. But the statement Nintendo made was unambiguous. No sign of non-backwards compatible versions appearing. There's not going to be a second version as far as we can see. It suggests straight up backward compatibility, as has been the case, to be fair, with almost every Nintendo system which used even vaguely compatible media. GameCube games could be played on Wii, Wii games on Wii U, and the Game Boy Advance could play Game Boy and Game Boy Color games, while its games could be played on the DS and DS games on the 3DS. Nintendo does have a history of supporting backward compatibility, but the question that I have is why announce now? They have tried to push info about the new system as late as possible on all occasions, and many people had resigned themselves to waiting until early next year for more detailed information on the successor to the Switch. So one can only assume that there was a specific reason that Nintendo wanted this particular information to launch now. Let's look into why. First of all, one could argue that they wanted something to change the narrative around Nintendo. The media are already going crazy with scare stories around massive dips in profits for Nintendo, which I personally think is really a misleading reading of Nintendo's financial information. As I've covered previously, the spring 2023 quarter was such an unusual spike, with Zelda Tears of the Kingdom and the Mario movie dropping, but actually Nintendo is still in a stronger position than it was even in the early Switch years. Nevertheless, catastrophe makes for good headlines, so throwing out a distractor might have been one thought in their minds. Instead of Nintendo is doomed headlines, we get a future-focused story, and that may be all there is to it. However, we should consider some other possibilities, and one of those is that they're potentially looking into reassuring nervous game purchasers. You see, Nintendo are going to be following these sales very closely as they come in live. They know how many eShop sales are being fulfilled live, they know how many pre-orders there are, and they will keep very close tabs on retail orders across the height of the holiday sale season. Now, for their own games, the titles that are launching are quite small scale, but of course they will also want to see people buying their legacy titles as well. And you can expect those evergreens such as Animal Crossing and particularly Mario Kart 8 to do huge business this holiday season. However, it's not just the first-party titles that Nintendo will be concerned about. There are third parties who will now be selling Switch titles as well, and those companies might have a legitimate concern that people will start holding off on buying these titles because they figure they may as well buy them on a new system or a different system which has a longer lifespan. So this confirmation that the Switch will be backwards compatible in the next generation must go some way towards reassuring players that they won't have to dig their Switch out of the attic this time next year to play their current game. Now, I suspect in the scheme of things, the number of people that this affects is relatively low. People either want to buy a game or they don't, and most people aren't going to wait hugely based on potential sequel consoles when they can already own a console in hand. Still, it must reassure a small number of consumers that their purchase will last the test of time, and in some respect it may actually spur sales. This might sound bizarre, but scarcity can often motivate people to buy. It's not a card they can afford to play too early as they don't want to sound the death knell to their system, but at least reminding people that there is a new system may have some fringe benefits as well as disadvantages. Still, all this also raises the possibility that Nintendo could announce a big game that people might be concerned about buying on the original Switch for fear of a successor version coming up, and now would feel safe in the knowledge that the game will continue to be available even on the new consoles. This would be particularly important if, as seems possible, Nintendo want to have some kind of major title to anchor the January to March sales window. Without the knowledge that the system will be backwards compatible, anything sufficiently major might instantly build hype around a potential Switch 2 launch for that specific date. Hype that is unhelpful to Nintendo as they try to dampen expectations so they surprise and delight rather than build hope and disappoint. Well, that's the idea anyway. The thing is, what kind of major title could there be for the spring quarter next year? And here I think the odds point to Pokemon Legends ZA. From the Pokemon Company's point of view, it will be 3 years since Pokemon Legends Arceus dropped at the end of January, time enough for the sequel to hove into view. From Nintendo's perspective, they have a big old gap in their schedule between early January's Donkey Kong Country Returns HD and late March's Xenoblade Chronicles X Definitive Edition. 90% says there's another game in there, and I think there's a 70% chance of 2 or more titles in this quarter 1 window. Now, I've gone into game slates before in another video exploring in quite some depth the different characteristics of different quarters' release schedules, but quite often Nintendo do like to end the financial year on a high. Animal Crossing New Horizons, Super Mario 3D World plus Bowser's Fury, and indeed the previous Pokemon Legends title. While it is a relatively prime time for remakes and remasters in Nintendo's year, it would be very surprising if all the company had for this quarter was repackaged old content, even at this late in the Switch's life. It's not unprecedented, as those April to June quarters of both 2020 and 2024 were all remakes and remasters except for ultra-casual titles such as Clubhouse Games and Endless Ocean. But if we assume that the new console is going to be their major focus in the April, May, June quarter next year, and whether it's released yet or not in that window, Nintendo will definitely want to start hyping it. All the more reason to end the current financial year on a high. There are other reasons as well why this would make sense. Firstly, let's look from the point of view of the Pokemon Company. The Pokemon Company have always been happiest supporting the older versions of systems. Apart from Pokkén Tournament DX, it was nearly 2 years before the first Pokemon game really came to Switch, and while they released Ultra Sun and Ultra Moon on the 3DS in late 2017 and Black 2 and White 2 on DS well into the lifespan of the console successors, in general they don't seem too committed to moving over incredibly promptly to new hardware. Now, things are a little different now, but I think it's still worth saying that having the Legends game being forward compatible is probably of use to Game Freak and the Pokemon Company more than anyone else at this point. The Pokemon Company are not likely to want to go indefinitely without a major retail title. Their last big Switch entry was Detective Pikachu Returns back last year, and Game Freak are as regular as Alamo when it comes to their generational releases. Every 3 years has been the pattern for a long time, and that will put Gen 10 of Pokemon releasing mid-November 2025. Now, there are reasons to think that Gen 10 may finally break that pattern. After all, the 30th anniversary is the following February, and the Pokemon Company might want to make it the centerpiece of the anniversary year. Nintendo also received a fair bit of flack for the state that Scarlet and Violet released in, and may wish to give a bit more time in the oven to the next game, especially if a version is available on their swanky new system and potentially needs to look its absolute best. But all things considered, I don't see any serious reason to doubt that Nintendo will at least aspire to get some Pokemon action to round off 2025, and if that's the case, Legends needs to release a whole lot earlier. In fact, it probably needs to release before Pokemon Day, so the Pokemon Company aren't cannibalizing their own sales by announcing information on the game. After all, in 2022, Legends Arceus had been barely 2 weeks on the market before the Scarlet and Violet news dropped, and the equivalent date in 2025 would be the 31st of January. That's 3 years exactly after Arceus, adjusted for the dates that Nintendo actually releases their games, which currently is on a Thursday. The other option would of course be to launch the game in the Pokemon Presents, but if this were the case, we will be looking at probably an April release for Legends ZA at the earliest. Difficult to imagine a game of this scale could be shadow dropped, and with Xenoblade Chronicles X Definitive Edition dropping in March, there's just not the space for Nintendo to give a game of this scale the oxygen it needs if they're putting it out in March. Waiting also makes sense if, as we've often assumed, Legends will be cross-gen or at least launch with the new system and showcase how good even Switch games can look on the new hardware. And yet there is another reason to think that a 31st of January or 7th of February drop could still be on the cards for Pokemon Legends ZA. Remember that Nintendo is seeking to net 12.5 million sales for the Switch for this financial year. If 12.5 million units are forecast to be sold, Nintendo still have a way to go to meet that highly ambitious target. So far, they've sold 4.72, so they need to sell 7.78 million in the last 2 quarters. Now, the first 2 quarters of the fiscal year saw 2.1 and 2.63 million sales respectively. The holiday quarter is typically more than double other times of the year, so let's say we get 5 million in the holiday window. Down on last year by 1.9 million, but still respectable. That leaves us with 2.78 million to hit their target, which they would need to get from quarter 1 of the next calendar year. However, the post-holiday window often sees a dip. Going below 2 million is not out of the question. I feel at this point Nintendo are on track for something closer to 11 million based on where they currently are. Well, it's too late to do anything about this holiday, but I think there is still scope for next year. They brought their forecast down from 13.5 million, but with the holiday season still to go, followed by the often quiet post-holiday quarter, if there is ever a game that Nintendo could sell bespoke consoles for that would excite the market and spike demand, it has to be Pokemon. Now, it's difficult to determine the precise potential impact of special edition systems in the past. There was clear evidence, though, in the recent Nintendo press release of a sales boost for the Switch Lite model in the last quarter, despite the fact that the model was generally worse selling than others because the Switch Lite tends to be less successful. The Zelda Switch Lite, therefore, was the only major change that has happened in that period, so clearly there is some kind of statistically significant impact of launching these kinds of remake systems. More than just a few thousand here and there, but enough to seriously demonstrate an increase in the kind of sales numbers that they want to see. I would think that a Pokemon title like Legends, which could be expected to clear 10 million sales, would have a bigger proportionate impact than something like Zelda Echoes of Wisdom on console sales as well. Although, to be fair, if most of these Pokemon players skew younger, perhaps the impact on consoles won't be quite so great. But if Nintendo do want to drop big news about ZA, they will want to do so soon. Not before Black Friday, I expect, but possibly not too far after. It feels unlikely as a Game Awards announcement, although strange things have happened, but Nintendo could ultimately announce any time. Another title that could have big impact as well will be Metroid Prime 4 Beyond, but here I really doubt they're going to drop it in February. With its high production costs and evident potential to showcase the new console's capabilities, it will be an odd move to drop Metroid Prime 4 early, even knowing the next system will be backwards compatible. I suppose the only reason to do this is if they didn't want to use it on their next system and they thought that actually splitting the player base would not be advantageous to a relatively low-selling title such as Metroid Prime. On the other hand, being able to show a new Pokemon game running on better hardware from the off might be quite helpful for Nintendo's advertising. Remember back to the days when the OLED was announced? Yes, we saw the forthcoming games modelled on it, like Zelda Tears of the Kingdom, Splatoon 3 and Metroid Dread, but it also showcased gameplay for Super Smash Bros. Ultimate and others. Nintendo will need to have trailer-worthy games for the Switch successor system, and so far they just have Metroid Prime 4 Beyond to trail. Having something substantial to showcase Legends ZA may be just the ticket. For more on Nintendo's game calendar, I think you will really enjoy the video on the screen right now. Otherwise, please take care, and I will see you next time for another Nintendo Forecast.